I just say hello quickly to our participants on Zoom. Hello, I walk away from the camera in a second, and you can only see me from the side. So let's get started. My name is Uwe Dulek. I'm the director or co-director of the Best Center at QUT. Rebecca is the other half of the leadership team, and I'm also an honorary professor here at NU for behavioural economics. So we actually thought this is a great opportunity to catch up after 2020 and losing some of the connections that were built previous to that. And we thought we do a joint session talking a little bit about what we think has changed with respect to behavior insights, behavior economics, and public policy over the last 18 months. And what are type of research projects that happened with us. Just a little bit of information up front. We record this session, so if you do have questions or you don't want to say anything, in that case, you're aware of that now. If you still ask a question and you don't want to be on the recording, let us know afterwards. But we would encourage you to ask those questions after the session when we stop the recordings. The program. Sorry, technology. The program for today. Yeah, there we go. So I start off with my 5-10 minutes called Behavioural Economics After 2020. I think where have we moved to and what's the type of work that we currently do at Best. Then Steve, first Rebecca will talk a little bit about the more behavioural driven work that we do, talking about co-designing work on behaviour change with respect to homelessness of women, so social policy topic. After that, we talk a little bit of, Steve will present some work on, we try to bring together behavioural economics with biomedical innovation, and we can give you some insights into that research. And then Matthias will talk about some work here at TTPI on compliance with penalties. And then we have John and Kevin here to talk about applications of behavioral economics, let's call it in the real life. John then from Kia, taking industry perspective, and Kevin Chadwick, who does a PhD here at AMU, but is also in which department now? Working on energy savings, but not representing the department, but giving us some insights about that. Okay, let's get started. I'll have to do it. Okay. You can move on to the next one. Okay, so very quickly, what is behavior? What is the Best Center? Best stands for Behavioral Economics, or the Center for Behavioral Economics, Society and Technology. And the main question we set out to work on was really taking this work on behavioral economics. I will give you a very quick refresher about what that meant when we started out in a couple of seconds, but really then look at social problems, but also ask how we can achieve better outcomes, not only with this focus on social policy questions, but also with respect to new technologies. All of that, I think, where we come from, the members in the team, see some about that later, are economists, behavioral scientists, but also people with a technology background. And we feel that bringing these together is maybe quite crucial to generate these new answers to advance society and the economy. If you just look at this bottom line, maybe gives you an idea what we try to achieve with the center as well. We do work with industry and government partners, but we do have a focus on research as well. So we try to bridge this space. Try to do more there. Can we? So just a quick reminder, and then I get back to why do I think behavioral economics has this potential. I think most of you here in the room know about Kahneman's work about behavioral biases, maybe the work that followed from that with Richard Thaler's and Carl Sunstein's work, nudge to more or less use these behavioral insights to think about how to engage with choice architecture to get better policy outcomes. Yes, next one. So once we have moved from bias to nudge, you very quickly may have heard about the EAST framework to really apply this public policy. So one way to think about this choice architecture is to think about how can you make choices for people easy, social, attractive, and timely to get better outcomes. Right? With this focus to help people make better decisions for themselves as judged by themselves. Now, where do I think have we moved from there? I think we have moved. Yeah, we have. Okay, great. We have started to look at behavioral economics as a way to not only identify what type of problems we have, and I think very often this type of idea to look at barriers to advances, changes that happen in society can be seen as technological barriers, where we may need new technologies. There are economic barriers, the type of externalities, if you're an economist as a background, or network effects are possible economic barriers, simply cost aspects, supply chain problems would be seen as economic barriers, and how can they be overcome. But I think the last step that we saw from this early work on behavioral economics is that these behavioral barriers are quite important as well. So at best, what we thought when we started out with our work was really to say that behavioral economics can identify what is the problem that we have, and then look for the solution. That was the first picture that came to my mind. But maybe it is the case that certain barriers you can think about how do you get over this barrier, or how do you tunnel under it, or how can you break through. Right, as the different type of approaches. And I feel behavioral economics, which is with its evidence-based, works very well placed to actually help you to identify what is the barrier and what's the solution. I think what we may have learned, it's very interesting, it seems to be, yeah, what we have learned maybe in 2020 was, and now this is the COVID story, that you may not only need one of these letters, and they may have all different types of functionalities, but you may actually need to combine these letters. I think for me, the COVID experience to some extent is we need the vaccine, we need to develop the technology to deal with that. We need to overcome the economic barriers, whatever the supply chain issues, the problems to distribute the vaccine fairly, who should have access when. But we also need to overcome, and that's what we I think currently see when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, we also need to overcome technological barriers. So I think actually that it is this case where we need to think how do we combine these different type of methods. I want to go a little bit further and talk really about concrete research for one way, and think about innovation. And I thought I'd give you just one insight where you think, well, this is a bit surprising in itself, how we can start thinking about it, why I feel behavioral economics can say something about this combination of bringing behavioral science, making economic barriers, and these behavioral questions and the technology questions together. This is a current project we do in the center, funded by an ARC grant, got some coverage in the New York Times, so it's good to talk about, and brings together these issues. Right? So if you think about one way to talk about technological or technical challenges, IP, patent knowledge is maybe a good example. And traditionally, we just know, we look at patents and look at it as a form of information or innovation. There are economic incentives involved, fits everything. But once you move away from the whole economicals as a way to look at these questions, you start to think that understanding this type of knowledge actually requires some sort of skills. So in this research project, we actually engaged with linguists to get a way to look at how accessible is information available with respect to innovation. And we compare different types of patents, in this case, patents from universities compared to patents filed by the corporate sector. And in theory, and if you have a home economicals, once there is disclosure, it shouldn't make a difference, right? All the information is there, past some sort of examination process. But in reality, what you actually find out is that these two patents are different in their accessibility. So on average, corporate patents are much harder to read, much less accessible than university patents. You can now start, and I think that's an interesting policy question then, to say what does that mean for society, and how do we organize that, right? And for me, it's a good example to really see how this type of being aware of behavioral barriers really opens up new views on how we can have progress in society and how we can make sure that say, intellectual capital of the country is actually used to its most prominent, and it's a different type of insight. So that's very quick insight of a small research piece that happened. I find this is an important area as well if we think about the innovations in COVID. How do we navigate that field? But just very quick summary of research that we do, and I also know. Oh, no, I quickly. This is just an example for one of the work that's done at the BEST Center. In total, there are 6 programs, and 3 of them will have short presentations. Rebecca talks about a program from behavior change and social marketing. Steve's one of our biomedical innovation behavior change program. 4 of the applied programs. Have a look at our webpage if you are interested in these other topics. I think I'll skip the one how we tackle problems and over to Rebecca because we already.
Oh, 2 hands. Okay. I'm not sure. Sorry, a bit of a tech issue there. I'm going to change the slide manually while we wait. Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about a project that we've got through the BEST Centre that involves a range of researchers from different areas. So we've got justice scholars, we've got scholars from the area of design, social marketing, information systems, and we're also working with a range of organisations that are at the front line in the homelessness area. Interestingly, you'll see that we've got a bank in there, and so the reason for that will become apparent in a moment. Okay, so the details are there for those interested in the slides. I'm going to go through this very quickly. So we're looking at women aged over 55 because they are the largest growing group, and we're actually a hidden group. So we're looking at all kinds of homelessness. We're not talking about sleeping rough. We're talking about hidden homelessness in particular, where you might be couch surfing or staying in a room with a friend or a family member, but that's not a permanent arrangement. One of the issues that we've identified with particularly older women is they don't identify as homeless. And in fact, you can give them all the information and facts and figures that they are in fact homeless, and it's just not part of their identity. And so one of the things that we wanted to step back and have a look at is we're looking at primary prevention. So we're the group of women that we're looking at working with for this project, they're not homeless yet. So we're looking at a really upstream approach, and we're right at that beginning tipping point of looking at the factors that actually lead to homelessness. But it's a bit like road safety. How do you prevent, how do you know that you've actually prevented deaths by the programs you've got? Well, it's very hard to measure because you've actually avoided something rather than dealt with it. We're looking at professional support in particular, and we're looking at engaging with early responders. And early responders are not first responders. So first responders are police and ambulance dealing with crisis. Our early responders are organisations whose core business is not preventing homelessness, but they come into contact with people who are experiencing some of the triggers. And so there's a real paradox there about how do you engage with these kind of organisations who have access to women who are experiencing the triggers, but that's not their job to solve homelessness. And so when we did a literature review, we identified 3 causes of homelessness that are not being dealt with by any organisation and the prevention space. So we looked at a change of circumstance, so that's loss of income, loss of partner, or loss of job. And they are 3 known triggers, and they're not particularly well dealt with. We're not in the domestic violence or substance abuse space. There are a lot of really good organisations there. And so we were looking at filling a gap in the prevention phase. It's not being dealt with. And so we decided to work with banks in particular. It could be real estate agents, it could be lawyers, and we've also got mortgage counsel involved. Because they're the ones that if you have a change of job or you have a change of relationship or you lose income, they're organisations that are right there at the front line dealing with your changing bank accounts. Or you're going to the library to access IT support to go and fill in a form in order to deal with that change of circumstance. We were going to originally look at high touch as well as high tech, but then COVID hit. So we will return to the high touch side of things, which is the face-to-face conversation. So at the moment, we're really dealing with the high tech side of things. And it's really about a proof of concept at this point. Can we work with organisations such as banks whose core job is not to address homelessness and yet be part of the prevention of homelessness? And so we're really at that really early stage. So one thing to point out, I'm drawing on social marketing literature around customers experiencing vulnerability. And this is a real mindset shift for us as well as the partners that we're working with. And so we're not using a deficit-based approach. That is, what do women lack? We're looking at a strengths-based approach. What are the resources that we have that we can leverage? And it's a really tricky way of thinking because typically when we see people who have experienced, say, homelessness or it's loss of job, we immediately go, what don't they have? What do we need to actually fill? The problem with that approach is it focuses on what they don't have. It's very passive, it can be very disempowering and putting people in the role of victim. It often leads to paternalistic interventions and the solutions are designed for people. If you flip it to a strengths-based approach, what it becomes is, what have you got that we can leverage? What's the knowledge? What are the resources that you bring to the table? It's really much more active. It's quite empowering and actually gives agency, and it leads to people-led interventions, and co-design is a really excellent technique that fits into this, where we design solutions with people, not for people. That's there just for those who want the PowerPoint slides. We developed a whole bunch of design principles, so we're using human-centered design in this approach. And this was drawn from the literature as well as expert proxies. So we've run a number of co-design workshops with people who deal with the front line and developed this set of principles. And really, that's what led us to the strengths-based approach. So at the moment, we've done a number of co-design workshops. We're in the user testing phase now. What we've come up with is a digital portal. To start the process, we developed a set of personas. And so what we've used is a butterfly metaphor. Butterflies are very much about transformation, is about empowerment. And we wanted something that was really friendly for women. And so the testing that we've done developed these 4 personas, again, based on literature and based on talking to women with lived experience. And remember that these personas are all in the prevention phase. None of them are homeless yet. Our ambers of the world, they will never be homeless. They're actually going to do okay as a loss of circumstance. But Delia is really struggling and she's right on the edge. Because remember, we're dealing with women who have experienced loss of circumstance, but we don't know which ones of them are actually going to have a problem. So we had to design up something that would work for all of these women, regardless of where they sat on the risk continuum. So what you hopefully can see here, we've got a couple of profiles. It's not the detail that matters. Basically, we looked at what are the support needs for each of our personas. And what we found for Amber is her highest support need was around esteem. She's not concerned about financial problems. However, Delia, who's about to go into crisis, her highest needs were informational, instrumental, and network support. And so we used this to design out different pages on a portal that would appeal to these different personas. And so what we've got, and this is the Women's Butterfly Project, is that our partners such as Suncorp and Motivate Council will send out an alert via either SMS, email, live chat, potentially an in-app message that says, oh, you know, we noticed that, you know, thanks for contacting us to indicate that you've had a change of relationship. Here's a website that might have some useful information for you. Pretty neutral, no mention of homelessness. They go onto the portal, they do a persona quiz so that we know where they might fit, and then they're directed to a page that's specifically designed for that particular persona. They will be invited to participate in research, but that's not mandatory. One of the things about the portal is that it's got no cookies and it doesn't remember them, and we've done that deliberately because we may have women who are in a domestic violence situation. The problem with that is that when they come back to the portal, it's not going to remember them. So we have to keep it really simple and really one click. And so basically they land on the portal. It's a very simple page. They have an overlay that they do a 10-question quiz. It's really kind of fun. It's got questions about, you know, what do you do on a slow night in? It's got questions about pets, but it's also got some really important questions in there that allow us to identify where they fit on that risk continuum. If they don't want to do the quiz, that's okay. They can go straight to their persona if they think they recognise themselves or if they've been before, or they can go direct to the different links. And we've arranged them around wellbeing. Again, it's in positive language rather than what you're missing. And so when they land on their persona page, all of the information is there, but it's just presented in a different way. So for Amber, we know that social esteem support was most important for her. And so all of these links will appear for Amber that we've summarised, and she can click through and go to these various sites. We're not trying to replicate the already great websites that are out there like Ask Izzy. It's really a portal, and it's not exhaustive because it's a proof of concept at this point. So basically what we've done is try and pick national agencies so that if it doesn't matter where they live in Australia, it's relevant, and that in itself has been a very big challenge because a lot of the support services are actually offered at the state or local level. And we've tried to pick very credible sites as well that we're trying to sell something. So we've been through a lot of processes to identify links that align with each of our wellbeing types. And you can see over here with Delia that her most pressing wellbeing issue is financial. And so the order is different for Delia, but Delia does have access to all of the different links if she chooses to take advantage of that. And I'll hand over now to Steve.
Hey, my name's Steve. I'm a behavioural experimental economist in the University Centre, and I'm going to talk with you a little bit about 3 studies. I'm going to try and squash results for 3 studies into 9 minutes. So we'll see how we go. But in relation to, I'm going to talk about adoption of new technologies. In case you haven't noticed, we're going through probably, as it was alluded to, the largest ever issues in relation to new technology adoption in relation to vaccine hesitancy. I have a 6-year-old daughter, and when in 2015, she got whooping cough when she was about 18 months old. And if you've ever seen a child with whooping cough, it's horrendous. It's absolutely. I remember saying to my partner at the time, we had gone through the vaccine process and vaccination process as with all our kids. But I remember saying, how could someone never want to get their children vaccinated? That's just insane. But as you know from a Monash study last week, apparently 1 in 5 Australians are vaccine hesitant. That's not anti-vaxxer, that's unsure. Some make some sort of cognitive bias. We don't know because we don't have the information yet to know who these people are. And I think I probably fall into this category. You know, there's question marks around, not around the epidemiological work, you know that sound in the advertising campaigns that are coming from the federal government allude to that, but there are question marks on why 1 in 5 people would be hesitant. So what I'm going to talk with you about today is in relation to some work Uwe and I have done with Dietmar Umaha, who's a biomaterials engineer at the Institute for Health and Biomedical Innovation. This is a silicon saline breast implant. It's obviously defective. To give you some context, in the US, about 400,000 women per year undergo reconstruction of some form of augmentation. And that's for every implant that goes in, 1 in 3 has some kind of surgical defect in the first 18 months. That's not 1 in every 3 women, that's 1 in every 3 implants. And what Dietmar and his biomaterials team have come up with is they take a 3D scan of the breast prior to mastectomy, and then they print this 3D scaffold, which is degradable. And what happens is it's put in underneath the muscle, and they take muscle from the thigh and the hip and pump it into the scaffold. And across 18 months, the scaffold dissolves and you're left with the original breast. It's pretty incredible technology. It's amazing to, as a behavioural scientist, to be working with people doing this crazy, amazing thing. So the question is, his interest is, well, how do we get people to transition to new technologies? So what we did, what we asked him was, how do people make decisions around the current technology? And he sort of said, well, there's some literature out there, but not much. So what we did, as Uwe points out, what Bess is interested in is evidence-based research. And what we wanted to do is go out and descriptively map the behaviour of women making decisions around reconstruction. Currently, there's 3 options: the silicon and saline implant that I showed you, a deep flap and a tram flap. The tram flap is where muscle is taken from the abdomen and then used to suture the breast. The deep flap is taken from the thigh or the hip. But essentially, what we asked them, when we ran a framing experiment, we asked them to rank or order based on either positive or negative frames in relation to their option sets. And what we see for 3 of the 4 options, the silicon, the tram flap, and the fat graft, is that when you frame in positive or negative, it changes the way that people make decisions, the way that patients make decisions. That could be good from a behavioural change perspective, it could be very bad also. So then what we went to do was we thought, well, how do patients, surgeons, nurses communicate? We asked them a really simple question. In your first interaction with your specialist surgeon, how long do you think you spent with the surgeon? We asked the patient, and they say, well, they spent about 40 minutes, about 39 minutes. Okay. How long with the nurse? About 27 minutes. We asked the surgeons, how long do you think you spent with the patient? About 45 minutes. How long do you think the nurse spent with the patient? About 21 minutes. Nurses, how long did the surgeon spend? About 30 minutes. Nurses, how long did you spend? About 49. There's something going on here between surgeons and nurses in relation to their impression about how long they have in that first contact, which tells you maybe asymmetric information, maybe some form of cognitive bias by the nurse and the surgeon, maybe some power dynamic, of course there is. But it's interesting to think about how the information is processed. We also asked them, or specifically we asked patients, surgeons and nurses, who made the decision in relation to your choice to reconstruct post-mastectomy? And what we saw was, we have a scale here. It was 100% your decision, or 0% your decision. We gave a sliding scale of between the surgeon and yours. And what we found was, well, there's lots and lots of women that believe it was 100% their choice. And then there's a large group of women that think, well, it was 50-50. The surgeon and I sort of came to a 50-50. But then what's really scary is that there's really large, about 1/3 of the population of 697 women thought that it was 0% their decision. Now, if you think about that, it's an elective surgery. Yeah? How do you have informed consent in an elective surgery if the patient doesn't believe that they were the one that made the choice? So we also did some other behavioural stuff. We looked at individual differences in relation to preference to reconstruct, and then the type of reconstruction undertaken. And almost all of the literature, this has just been accepted into the British Journal of Surgery, because basically all of the previous literature points to different individual differences in patient populations and says, well, this is definitive, or this is highly correlated with choice to reconstruct. But when we control for everything, age is the only thing that seems to have a relationship with women choosing to undergo reconstruction and the type of reconstruction that they undergo. We control things like offspring, ethnicity, height and weight, which is actually medically some of the recommendations on what reconstruction should happen. And then finally, this is just an interesting one. This is the third paper. It's not finished yet. I'm still at the minutes. Still at timing, okay. I think I'll catch up for being behind it. And this is what's interesting. I presented this research 2 weeks ago at the Best Centre Conference. Going back to vaccine hesitancy, advertising campaigns are great, and like we talked about before, advertising is awareness. But really, what we want to do with vaccine hesitancy is target groups to change behaviour. This is the third study, and we asked patients, surgeons, and nurses, if you were going to transition to a new biomaterials 3D scaffold alternative, where would you get your information from? What would be the tipping point? We grouped them into 3 areas. So here are your regulatory scientific areas in the red and the pink. And you see surgeons and nurses, naturally because of the processes that they undergo, are going to favour this sort of scientific or the regulator. What's really interesting is these blue areas, and it's information that's coming from a former patient. Some hypothetical, if you could talk to a former patient that underwent this process and was successful, that would be the tipping point. And what we see here is overwhelmingly patients favour information from former patients. Nurses have some interest in former patients. Surgeons have none. Not a single surgeon in our population said talking to a former patient would be the catalyst for me to change to a new technology. It is survey data, yeah, it's stated preference, not real preference, because we can't have a natural field experiment with new technology. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's anything really, I don't think that's controversial that a surgeon doesn't say that talking to a former patient. But I think it's interesting that nurses do. And this sort of goes back to this vaccine hesitancy. I'm not a social marketer, but if I was running an ad campaign, the current ad campaign for federally is epidemiologist after doctor after epidemiologist after doctor saying the vaccine's great for you, you should take it. But what we're seeing here is that people believe the science. And these women clearly, they have undergone reconstruction, so they believe in medical science, but they want their information from someone that's gone through it. I think that from a behavioural sense, that's behavioural responders. I think that's super interesting because that's telling you there's some kind of peer or social effect there that isn't based on pure science. So, cool.
So what's your insight?
No questions.
So what's your insight for the advertising then? What should they be doing?
I think that peer effects. I think the next round of advertising will revolve around nature. It will revolve around pro-social behaviours. But again, we don't know who vaccine hesitant people are because we don't really have any hard science on them. It's too new. Thank you. I enjoyed 2 and 6.
Great, thanks very much. Very, very interesting. Okay, hi. My name is Matthias Simon. I'm an applied nutrition and I work here at the Corporate School and the Deputy Director of the Test and Transfer Policy Institute. Yeah, very warm welcome to everyone. Very happy we could manage to run this joint event together with the Best Centre. I'm going to talk about paying penalties. That's what I've been scheduled for. I'm also saying something about taxes, because we've done some behavioral work on tax policy as well. Now, before I start, can I just ask who in the room works on tax or transport policy issues? Okay, thanks. I might just start by saying just a couple of things about what we do here at AU. The Tax and Transport Policy Institute is part of the corporate school we were established in 2013 with seed funding from the Australian government, and do research on issues related to tax and transport policy, essentially to have an informed public debate and help have an informed public debate about tax and transport policy issues in Australia. And we do this through a range of activities, including well, research and education, of course, but also bringing together researchers from across Australia and internationally. This is quite a good example for an event. We try to be a platform for researchers in Australia who meet and talk typically about tax and transport policy issues, but then we are very strong on the behavioral front, so it's very useful to have a broader discussion about behavioral economics and behavioral sciences than just in the tax and transport space. And then secondly, of course, also tax and transport policy. Once you start thinking about it, you realize it's actually related to almost everything. So everything there's probably something that can be linked back. So it's quite surprising actually. We do interact a lot with government. We try to build public service capability through executive education and courses and seminars and so on. And of course, we try to be active in media. I try to keep my presentation quite simple because one of my trials, you can see, I find in one of my trials that simplification is a very important thing in the tax and transport context, and I believe it's also generally a good thing, especially this time of the day. Giving you too much information may not be very effective. So I just have a few slides with a few letters that I want to show you that we sent out together in collaboration with the ATO, but also in collaboration with the ACT government. And we've done some trials as well in PNG and Indonesia. I've worked with the ARC, the Internal Revenue Commission in PNG on the project, and also done some work in Indonesia, but I'm not going to talk about that work. I'm going to focus on the work we've done in Australia. So this really just summarizes essentially what I'm going to discuss. We've done work with the ATO over several years, like a longer-term project where we did a number of RCTs, and one of them I want to talk about is one really interesting finding, I think, from those RCTs was that if we simplify messages, it can really make a huge difference. It's not necessarily something that's very sophisticated or complicated. Often behavioral economics is just really powerful if we keep things simple. I'm going to show you an example in a second. Another example I want to show you is we've tried to address social norms and compared messages that address social norms to more kind of traditional messages where tax enforcement is being used, where the focus is much more on penalties, or the possibility of penalties and interest charges. And there's some interesting findings I can show you there. In the work with the ACT government, that's my penalties work that I've done with the ACT government. We implemented the trial where we sent out letters to people who have not paid their traffic and parking fine in the ACT for more than 6 months, quite a long period, so very strong non-compliers. You may be one of them, I know you received one of those letters. I'm going to show you these letters and then just talk you through some of the results. I don't have any tables or any more sophisticated. So this is our one of the first trials we did with the ATO, and we discussed a number of possible interventions, and they gave me a number of letters, and they said, this is what we want to send out, or this is what we're currently sending out to taxpayers, and among those letters, it was this letter that is being sent to small businesses, mainly small businesses. It's about employer obligations, and you can't, don't worry about the details of this letter if you can't read it. The point here is that this is the cover of an 11-page letter, and this letter is being sent to small businesses in Australia, and turned out that they didn't really comply with their filing obligations. They didn't file on time. They didn't seem to know what they needed to do. And when I had a look at this letter for the first time, of course, the only thing I could think of, the only intervention we can do here is just have a cover letter. So we just created a one-page, nice cover letter that just summarized what people needed to do. And then we had 11 pages in the attachment with all those details. We didn't actually change those 11 pages. We just had a cover letter, a one-page cover letter. Now we increased the watching rates by 70% by just making that one change. We actually had a very small trial with a very small number of cases in the treatment and control group, but because the effect was so enormous, we found that not just strong but also highly significant effect. So that's one example, one interesting example of the things we've done. The other example I want to show you is something I'm currently working on. It's a paper I'm currently working on. We've sent out 2 letters to new entrants to the tax system, especially new entrants to the income tax system. In Australia, you can think of those groups as mainly young people who leave school and take up their first job and they have to pay income taxes for the first time. But also, there's a fairly large group of immigrants or people, foreign-born workers who arrive in Australia, and they may be older, and they are entering the income tax system and have to pay income taxes for this time. Now, the standard letter that the ATO used to send out was a letter that says, we have not received your tax return, and it's pretty kind of neutral. It has a bit of, actually addresses a bit of social norms, because at the time already they knew about the effectiveness potentially of saying something about social norms issues. But the main emphasis of this letter here is really on the possibility of penalties and interest charges. So essentially what the letter is saying, well, you have not lodged your income tax return on time, and if you don't lodge soon, without specifying an exact date, there may be penalties and there may be interest charges. Now that's the standard letter, which is what the literature calls the deterrence message. So we're trying to enforce certain tax law. Whereas the second letter that we tried out, that was a letter specifically designed in collaboration with the ATO to, well, essentially to try and make a first good impression. So this is the first interaction that the ATO is having with taxpayers, and they're saying, welcome to the tax system, you need to lodge your first tax return. And the focus here is very different. It's not, it doesn't mention enforcement law, it doesn't mention penalties or anything like that, but the focus here is very much on lodging your tax return is free, doesn't cost anything, it's easy. And also this letter mentions social norms. So both letters actually mention some social norms. This is something we could not convince the ATO not to include in both letters, but the focus here is a very different one. The focus clearly is the non-deterrence, friendly letter that focuses on the fact that it's very easy to lodge. And another thing that is emphasized here in the letter is the use of the MyText system. You may probably all of you know, or most of you know, MyText is this online tool which you can access through the MyGov website, and it makes it very easy to lodge your income tax return. You can just do it online. Whereas I should mention there was a page 2 for this first letter here. On the second page, MyText was mentioned as one of 4 possible ways of lodging your tax return. There are other, you can print your tax return and send it in the mail and so on. So there are other options, but this letter here emphasized MyText much more. Now, we have, I hope I convinced you, we have 2 fairly different interventions here. We have 2 fairly different letters. There was also a control group that didn't receive any communication from the ATO over our trial period. In total, this is a very large trial. We had 4,000 letters of the first type. We sent 4,000 letters to new entrants to the tax system. We sent another 4,000 letters of the welcome letters. It was to another random group, second treatment group. And then, sorry, finally, the control group that didn't receive any communication. There were about 10,000 people in the control group. Now, what we found is, I thought, was quite surprising that the effects, we looked at 6 or 7 different outcomes, the effects were almost exactly the same of those 2 letters on various outcomes. And one of the reasons, or I think the main reason, what we believe happened here was that the way information is being provided to people didn't matter very much to these new entrants to the tax system. What mattered a lot was that they received information. Compared to the control group who didn't receive any information, we see that lodgement rates from both of these letters increased lodgement rates by 15 percentage points. Both letters increased the use of MyText by 10 percentage points. And the differences between those outcomes and between those effects are not significant. So we actually find that fairly different types of messaging can lead to the same in this context. But I have to specify, I have to also say, this is a very selected group. When you look at new entrants to the tax system, they are not like your average taxpayer. They are not representative of taxpayers in Australia. They are only, of course, representative of new entrants to the tax system. When we looked closer at our data, we actually saw that 99% of the people who hadn't lodged their income tax return on time would have actually received a refund. They were just unaware of the fact that they had to lodge. So providing information really was a very important aspect, whereas the way we provided information here didn't really seem to matter that much. Okay, I'll give you this third example. This is the penalties trial that we did. And here again, we sent out 2 letters. We had 2 treatment groups. This was done in collaboration with the ACT government. And, they were in that situation where they had about 10,000 people in the ACT, but also mainly actually in New South Wales, who hadn't paid their traffic or parking fines in the ACT for more than 6 months. And I asked people, well, what do you do about these people? How do you collect the money? What do you do about them? And the answer was, well, at the moment, nothing. We don't contact them at all. And so we clearly saw there was some scope for improvement potentially by sending them a letter. But I have to say, if you lose your right to drive, you can lose your right to drive in the ACT if you do not pay your penalties. So there is a certain incentive, especially for the people who live in the ACT and drive in the ACT to make sure that they pay the traffic and parking fines. But we do see that as a result, a large fraction of the people in our sample, more than 80% of the people came from New South Wales. and also, we only looked at New South Wales and the ACT, and might be in the other states as well. But clearly, those people who reside in the ACT had an incentive to pay earlier because they may lose the right to drive. That's how Access Canberra frames it. I can't say exactly what that means, but that's what they say on their website. Now we sent 2 letters, and compared to the business as usual group, which remained like a very large group, we had 8,000 people in the control group. They didn't receive any letter. And then we had 1,000 people in each treatment group. And this is the first treatment letter, which says that most people with an overdue fine have already paid. And here at the top right, it says, you have an overdue fine, please do the right thing and pay now. So this is essentially addressing social norms. You can break it down. These are like descriptive and inductive types of social norms, so that we are trying to address something by saying that most people with a fine like this have already paid, do the right thing and pay. So that's our social norms message that we're trying here. And then the second letter is a more kind of traditional letter, which says unpaid fines don't go away unless you take action, just like enforcing. And at the top right, it reads that we, I don't know what does it mean? We can't see what it says. You still have, you notice that you still notice that we have a fine to take action today. Thanks. And those were the treatments we looked at. Now, what we find is that the enforcement in this context worked really well. The social norms also worked, but the effects were somewhat weaker. We find that for every letter that we send, every enforcement letter saying the fines don't go away, we raised on average $5. Like on average, people would pay $5 in outstanding traffic and parking fines. And the social norms letter was also effective compared to the control group. We raised $3. So that suggests that there are some differences here between those letters, and then we broke it down and actually looked at subgroups. And we see that the social norms letter was actually much less effective for certain subgroups. And it turns out that especially young people were not responding to the social norms letter. There were also a few other subgroups that we saw. People with a speeding fine, for example, they didn't respond to social norms. And we also found a few other groups, but especially for the young people, we found that it's quite a striking result that we don't see an effect here of addressing social norms. There are a number of, I'm just working on writing up the paper at the moment. There are, of course, a number of reasons, underlying mechanisms, why or why not we see certain results. I don't have enough time to actually talk about the details, but you can probably imagine that fine payments and tax payments are not exactly the same. So this is actually another interesting, fairly new research area, because we know a lot about tax compliance, but not so much about fine compliance. And people have very different motivation for paying parking fines or paying traffic fines. They may feel that a fixed fine system may be unfair, for example. But it could also be that people have, they feel that there is a relationship between paying taxes and getting something in return, having this reciprocal kind of character of paying taxes. That's not necessarily there when you get fines, especially when you live in New South Wales. You get a parking fine in the ACT, that there's no gain that you would have from paying that parking fine, because money will be spent on the ACT. So there are reasons why there are differences between fines and taxes. I just want to, is that how much time do we have? 1 minute left? Okay. If you're interested in the details, there will be a paper on all the underlying mechanisms coming out there. So before I stop, I just want to very quickly say, go a step back, or stop working more, you know? And
No. Looks like it stopped completely now. Just enter. Oh.
Okay, this is my last slide. Sorry about that. Just before I let you go, I just want to briefly say, in general, from a department perspective, why I think it's useful for people in government departments to collaborate on this. These are some of the reasons that I usually provide to people. That there's many more reasons, but in general, I think it makes a lot of sense for government departments to work with academics, not necessarily with us, but there are many others out there as well. These are some of the reasons we do. Perhaps a few things I can briefly mention. I think independent research clearly is one thing that's very important. If you look at government departments and trials that they run, often I hear stories where it feels like it's difficult to avoid confirmation bias. If you already have an idea in mind and you think this should work, then maybe you will implement a trial in a way and find the results that you already knew you would find. Having independent researchers looking at the situation may change how you perceive and how you implement certain trials. I think that's quite important. Obviously, transparency is an important one. We publish all the findings. Typically, we try to publish everything. We also, because we work at universities, have to get ethics clearance from our human ethics committee, so we make sure that everything, all the trials that we implement are ethical. The main issue, of course, is always related to privacy issues and identifying people in data sets and so on. It's not a main kind of concern typically with trials, but I'm just highlighting that these are some of the big advantages. Obviously, if you work with people like Uber or people here, then there are a number of people who have a lot of experience working with government departments, not just implementing trials for academic reasons, but we want to understand what really matters to government departments, what are the relevant questions, and how can we design trials that are scientifically rigorous and at the same time. I'm going to stop here. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we move to the next part. We bombarded you with a couple of research projects. I thought we get a couple of practitioners talking as well, and hand over to John. Okay, video and interpretation. Thank you. Firstly, the fear is going to control listening. Secondly, I'm not going to talk a lot of academic rigor. I'm going to talk with just the insight, actually. So, Peer Consulting, by the way, who you probably don't know, is an amazing company. Go to the website, hang on for a bit, www.peer.com. Sit on a few pages for a few minutes and really screw up the marketer's numbers. We'll do the job, but I'll tell you, most of the business that we're about is helping organisations fix difficult problems. Most of it's about projects and so on, but a lot of it's been about dealing with really complex stuff that they really can't get to the bottom of. So I got excited about behavioural economics because most of our work has been around influence and persuasion and negotiation and change, and this is really doing that on scale, in my view. Anyway, my 2 cents. Now throw something up on the slide. Oh, my slide. We're talking about evidence, and firstly, this actually comes out of a Department of Social Services report. It doesn't have anything to do with behavioural economics. We've got a lot to do with evidence, but it was a huge report. It's used a lot of detail, and they said $59 million a year spent on 1,400 people in a place called Rover in Western Australia. 206 different services delivered through 63 different agencies, and every program set they met their outcomes. $750 million over 15 years, no discernible social outcome on 1,400 people. We've got to stop doing that nonsense. I'll be blunt. We're talking about 90% of the businesses in Australia are small businesses, mum and dad businesses, mostly micro businesses. Most of them haven't finished year 10, let alone year 12. Who would have thought 11 pages from the tax office would be difficult for them to understand? So my view about evidence and basis and research is it's got to be practical and relevant and quick. As I move forward in the business I run, double-blind studies with control groups are great, except we don't have the time to do them, and they're too long to make evidence-based decisions for decision makers across government. So it's fine for the theory behind it, but if we want to drive change and new ways of doing business, we've got to provide them with sufficient evidence to make a decision. So the medical grade research and study based is fine, but we've got to come back from that a little bit, I think, to understand how to inform them to make rational decisions. That would be my first one. Oh, by the way, picking 10 Harvard students out of the quadrangle and sticking them to do a research program and do some tests is not scientific research, and the book that comes out of that is like, I don't know, if that's a research document, then Neighbours is a documentary. Then I got asked cyber. We talked about cyber because we're planning to do some work with Uber and stuff around cyber. Now I've got some really clever people working in my business, like really clever, really smart people. We get a bit of a phishing attack in our business that goes on. We get this email every now and then, very hard to block it actually, because you cannot defeat the technology. There's always some smarter person out there who can get around your firewall. In fact, this is entirely outside of our network. Who would have thought these people, master's degrees, 20 years worth of science, study, work, and whatever in the environment, would have spent $1,000 on an iPhone case? They did. So if we were, and this is where I get my next door neighbour, and we're talking about the tax guy now, but my next door neighbour runs a trucking business, and they've got a farm. How does he deal with this? How do we change the behaviours for them to deal with this? How do we get them to think more wisely? Somehow we've got to teach people to be safe in the cyber world, and it's not all about technology. So I've got to lean on you to talk about and find out how we're going to do this. For me, that's the question: how do people make wise decisions for themselves and make good choices? So we're pretty keen about doing something around cyber, probably because of technology defeats me. So I was just going to make a comment before we finish, or I finish because it's been 5 minutes. For my business, the world is around influence, negotiation, persuasion. A whole lot of it's around strategy and making wise decisions about what the strategies are that are going to unfold and where they go. The issues that sit in here really not revolve around bias and really biased decision making. People don't make wise choices, whether they be executives or whether they be the greater population. They don't make wise choices, they make them based on instincts, biases, and history. So we've got to find ways to fix that. And the issue is about behaviours, about people, the way people behave collectively, so not just as individuals, but also as organisations. So can we get them to think about things for self-preservation, to do things better? So we're looking for behavioural economics to help us do that. We're looking for organisations and individual behaviours to be changed, particularly around decision-making, and can we deliver them actionable evidence, not just the theoretical evidence. There's my 2 cents worth. Am I done 5 minutes? Okay. I've got this slide in a different colour, by the way. Sorry, who's next? You are. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ian Chadwick. As was mentioned, I'm a PhD student here at ANU, but also industry science and energy and resources in consumer policy. So while I'm presenting a research piece, I have come from a policy perspective. But I've realised that we've covered necessarily important for students. So I'm just going to quickly what's the term? Country. So actually that was the traditional analysis of local land and around here, that's the environment we have with people. Pay my respects to their elders, past, living, and emerging, and that's the most acknowledge the ongoing contribution that they make to our society, and extend that to anyone in the room or on Zoom who's Aboriginal to Australia back then, and also that anyone can add something to wherever everyone is in New Zealand. So I'll go clicker. Is it either one? No. Okay, so this is essentially a systematic review that we into what are the human factors that influence household adoption of energy technology. The context is in the work of an energy transition that's happening at the moment, where we're shifting from a centralized, highly centralized system based on fossil fuels, coincidentally, but and where we essentially push power down a cable and people use it and pay for it. What's happening, no doubt be aware, lots of solar panels going up these roofs and battery programs and things. It's becoming much more decentralized. Consumers, so the vision of the industry is that we'll have active consumers who use those what are called distributed energy resources. They use their appliances to support the network as we go forward. And when I'm working in policy, I'm aware that a lot of those policies, and all of those policies, tend to rely on price signals, changing in prices, different tariffs that people can choose from, in order to try and encourage them to change their behaviour and to adopt particular technologies and use them in particular ways. But important in this context, I think, is allow someone else to control them for you. So my research questions are really a large one. So what are the factors that influence them? What could policy actually be based on, rather than just assuming there's a pricing, maybe pieces of information. So are those methods up there? There are some of my other questions that will become evident as well as I move on as quickly as I can. So I looked into over 181 papers, and I did content analysis looking at, in all of those papers, then what factors did they actually find had influenced people's adoption or rejection of technology. And came up with there were like 100 odd of those factors, and through what was done systematic analysis, I managed to knock them down into 5 groups there. And we've got the context of people's essentially people's living circumstances. The cognitive route there is essentially the information and the skills that people need to make a deliberative kind of cost-benefit analysis. And those are the things we often include in policy. But they're also noticing the social influences. What other people do influences what we think other people think we should do. So we also do things because of other people. Affective factors are these more emotional responses. Is it a risky aspect? Is it big aspects of fear and losing control? Do I trust people to actually control my energy in my own for me? And finally, behavioural, and that's essentially how people live their lives on a day-to-day basis. So they go way beyond the techno-economic assumptions. And my 5th research question is actually, does it make any difference? And so I won't go into the detail of that, but I did a regression analysis on the findings of different papers that included a model, and found that including factors in more categories, does make a difference. It is actually, if you can include more factors in 2 rather than 4 categories rather than 2 categories, you'll be better able to explain this. So these are very high level findings from applying that framework that I came to the literature itself that I looked at, and then high level findings is that those affected factors seem to be of more relevance to rejection rather than adoption, and to whether people are looking to adopt or reject an innovative or unstable I chose to look at those questions in particular because in the energy transition I'm talking about, and it's a rapid mainstream adoption of technology and ways of using it that's actually important. Don't have 25 years to wait for someone to finally get it right. So, and most people, the majority of people, reject new technologies. Yeah, there's only a small number of people that get on board. And so we got here to tell me what both the rejection and the penalties. So is that about the decision people are making with the technology, or is it actually, are we reading something here about the decision making themselves? Are they actually mainstream consumers who are fundamentally different to early adopters? And there's a book there by Jeffrey Ballman in 1991 that talks about why 99% or something technology products fail to go any beyond 10 or 15% of the population, and it's because they fail to recognise that mainstream people are different to early adopters who first got in the market. And I could probably end there because I've probably spoken for long enough. But there are some other modules of mine that we can make that slide available, and I'll be here to chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I think now your questions are increasing for individuals and our presentations. But do you have a question? Do you have questions from Zoom? Do you see the chat? You don't have a chat. I get that chat. Yeah. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Or we just have a couple of drinks. That's a good chance, a good way to spend time as well. There we go.
On the types. So when you didn't get results between, was it the deterrence and non-deterrence, what impact did that have? Like this, did that kind of freak out your partner, or they just went on? Okay.
We did get results. We did see that there are effects compared to the control group. What we didn't see was a difference between the letters.
Yeah, that's right.
And, I actually don't know what the video are currently doing in terms of letters. So we have to go back and ask if they started implementing the welcome letter. We haven't actually spoken about the final results. I'm currently writing this up, but I will go back and see if they will adopt one or the other decision.
Will they go back to the original letter, or will they adopt the welcome letter?
That's right. In the case with the simplification, we clearly adopted that. With that, I mean, as you've seen, it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as you provide information. But I guess sending a welcome letter is a nice thing to do, but it doesn't. It's just send a root. It's like a root letter. That was his intent.
Matthias, I've got another question for Matthias actually. So just whether some of those effects are actually additive or something.
Yeah, just a question for Matthias. Whether some of those effects are actually additive. So you've got two different letters. Could you have a third letter which uses both?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's excellent. So, of course, when we test treatments, what we do is we randomize and we assign people randomly to a group that receives a letter, or to a group that receives another letter, or to a group that doesn't receive anything. We can't send two letters to the same group. You can either receive one or the other, but not both. And that's essentially one of the problems we're facing with anything we try to evaluate. We can either run a treatment group or a control group or some other treatment group, but we can't, and we weren't able to combine. So this brings me to another point that's actually quite important to mention. There are institutional limitations, and there are certain things that could be done in practice in collaboration with the HO. There were certain things they allowed us to do, there were other things they didn't allow us to do. For example, I had social norms messaging in both letters. I didn't like that, but the enforcement letter that said, or the letter that emphasized the penalties already was the business as usual letter, and it already had a certain amount of message, and they did not accept the idea of changing the business as usual. What we were allowed to do was to add a new letter, and they very much preferred to also have a social norms message in that new letter. So there was very little for us to do, but there are certain things that have to be negotiated. You can tell there are practical difficulties, there are real life issues that have to be negotiated with academics. From an academic perspective, it wasn't ideal, but it's important to do these things in the Thank you.
If there are no further questions, I think we have a bit of chance to talk more, and there was a requirement of presentations. Maybe that's a good opportunity for those people online. Thanks for joining. Either enter questions into the chat, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. You can download the chat questions as well. Thank you very much. Join us for some videos if you're in the room, otherwise it will be harder to do. Thanks.